Welcome back to my channel, where we dive into spine-chilling true stories from all walks of life. In today's video, we have 4 eerie tales from security guards who worked the night shifts at funeral homes. Their encounters with the unexplained will leave you questioning what truly happens when the lights go out and the silence settles in. From strange knocking sounds to unexpected visitors, these stories will send shivers down your spine. So grab a blanket, sit back, and let's get into these unsettling tales of the supernatural. Story number 1. Years ago, I worked as a security guard at a funeral home. It was March 2007, and there was a wake scheduled from noon to 9 p.m. A woman had passed away, and there was a small gathering of people. Shortly after 9 p.m., everyone was gone except for the funeral director, a clerk, and me. After thoroughly checking all the rooms, the funeral director locked the 2 main viewing rooms. Then he and the clerk left. My shift ended at midnight, so I had a couple of hours to patrol the exterior rooms and lock up. If I needed to get into the main visitation room, where the body was, I had to call the director. I'd been on the job for a couple of weeks and had gotten over most of my initial nerves. I was relaxing at a desk in the main hall, watching television, when I heard a loud thump from the room where the body was. That night, there was only one viewing, and the casket was closed with some flowers placed on top before we locked the doors. When I heard the noise, I turned down the TV and listened carefully. After a while, I heard what sounded like scratching. I walked slowly over to the double doors and put my ear against them. I could hear something like footsteps or movement, as if someone was walking around inside. Thinking that maybe someone had accidentally been left behind, I knocked on the door and asked if anyone was in there. The footsteps stopped abruptly. Then they seemed to come toward the door. I got really scared and backed away. The handle on the door started to move slightly, and that's when I panicked and ran. I sprinted until I reached the room with the phone and called the funeral director. I told him something strange was happening in one of the visitation rooms, that I had heard noises. I didn't mention the footsteps or the door handle. I didn't want to sound crazy. He told me to wait for him until he got there. I went outside and waited for him. As I waited, I felt like my soul was slowly leaving my body. About 20 minutes later, he arrived, and we both went inside. He walked over to the visitation room without any hesitation and opened the door. There was nothing unusual, but the bed of flowers that had been placed on top of the casket was now on the ground. The funeral director looked around, then picked up the flowers and put them back on the casket. We both left, and he locked up again. I told him I didn't want the job anymore and that I was quitting that night. He gave me a strange look, but I left and never went back. Story number 2. Every funeral home is different, but usually the ones that keep bodies in freezers hire security to guard the place at night. As a security guard, it's an easy job. You just patrol the parking lot, and if you get sleepy, you can get up and walk around. Your main task is to make sure no one breaks into the funeral home, especially the freezer. Believe it or not, people have tried breaking in before. I often get assigned to a funeral home with a freezer that's locked at all times. Even I don't have the keys to it. There's also a main hall where the walls are lined with coffins, each sealed and marked with a person's name and the years they lived. Some people prefer to be buried this way, in spaces for full coffins or small ones for ashes. And sometimes it's the coffins or small ones for ashes. One night, while patrolling the funeral home, I heard knocking coming from the area where the wall coffins are. I went inside to investigate, and the knocking continued, leading me to an empty spot in the wall. The funeral director, who used to stay late, had told me before that the knocking was nothing new. It happens sometimes, so I shouldn't worry about it, as long as no one breaks in. In other words, the place was haunted. A week later, a person named Adam was buried in that empty spot. Initially, there was no name on the spot, but now it had a name and dates. 3 nights later, the knocking returned at 2 a.m. I went back inside to investigate and found brown liquid seeping from the spot where Adam was placed. The next morning, I reported this to the funeral director. They had to remove Adam's coffin and place it elsewhere while they investigated the area. I remember the smell when they took the body out. It's hard to describe, but it smelled like sour farts. I even overheard the funeral director say something like, "Maybe Adam doesn't like this spot." I still work as a security guard there because it's an easy job. Who would be crazy enough to come to a funeral home at night? I'd rather deal with knocking and spirits than with POS humans. Story number 3. It was September 2020, during the whole pandemic lockdown. Normally, Hmong families don't choose American funeral homes due to their lack of understanding of Hmong culture and funeral traditions. However, during that time, the Hmong community didn't have much of a choice. There were too many funerals happening, and all the Hmong funeral homes were booked. The Lee family decided to book this American funeral home. Due to the whole lockdown and restrictions of 2020, the funeral home only allowed visitation from 6 a.m. to 8 p.m. The family came in to decorate the place and hung Joe's papers. They arranged flowers around the emptied casket. The body wasn't being brought in until the next day, which was Saturday. After decorating, the family left for the night. That night, I was on duty At around 11 p.m., I heard something crash in the main hall where the casket was. I knew there was no body in the casket yet, so I went to investigate. I realized that all the decorations that had been hung were now on the floor, but no one was in the room. I even checked inside the casket to see if anyone was hiding there, but it was empty. I just left it at that and continued to guard and patrol the funeral home. I finished my shift at 7 a.m., and when the Lee family arrived at 6 a.m., I told them what had happened. They put the decorations back up, knowing that later that day they would bring the body to the casket. That night, I came back to work and started patrolling the area again. The main hall had large windows, and even the doors were glass, so I could see inside. The casket was still half open. The hall had some lights on, but it was dimly lit. At exactly 11 p.m., I returned to the side of the building with the big glass window and noticed that all the decorations had fallen again. As a security guard, it's my job to check things out, so I went back inside. There was no one there, and when I looked in the casket, I noticed a strange smell, but no body in the casket. I assumed the body hadn't been brought in yet. So I left the casket open and went back outside to patrol. At 6 a.m., the Lee family arrived and I opened the door for them. I told them that the decorations had fallen again. One of the grandmothers approached the casket, crying and reaching down as if she was touching something. She began mourning. Curious, I got closer, and that's when I saw it. There was actually a face in the casket. There was a corpse inside. What the freak? I was shocked and spooked. Last night when I checked, there was no body or corpse in the casket. The Lee family believed that the corpse didn't like the decorations, and that's why the decorations kept falling. So they threw them all into the dumpster. That night, I was too scared to go back, so I called in sick. I don't know who patrolled the funeral home after that. Story number 4. I remember it was a cloudy night, and I was patrolling a funeral home in my car. This wasn't just a funeral home, but also a mortuary where they cremated bodies. In the basement, they kept the bodies, and on the first floor, they held the funeral services. I knew that the next day, which was Saturday, there would be a funeral service. Around 11 p.m., I saw a woman smoking near the entrance of the funeral home. Due to the fog, I couldn't see her clearly, but I could make out her outline and the glowing tip of her cigarette. I drove closer to the entrance with my car, got out, and went to talk to her. I asked for her name and she said it was Mary. I told her she couldn't smoke by the entrance and asked her to move elsewhere. She looked at me with tired eyes and a wrinkled forehead, probably between 50 and 60 years old. She was wearing shorts and a black t-shirt. Then she walked off toward the cemetery on the right. Later, around 3 a.m., it was cold and I was parked at the back getting really sleepy. I knew the funeral director would be arriving at 6 a.m. to prepare for the service, so I tried not to fall asleep. That's when I heard a knock on the passenger side window. I rolled the window down a bit and it was the same woman. She asked if she could sit in the car with me because she was cold. I told her no and explained that she couldn't hang around the area. She walked back into the street and turned toward the cemetery again. At 6 a.m., the funeral director arrived. He went into his office for a bit, then came out and placed a sign at the entrance that read, "In loving memory." Beneath that, the name on the sign was Mary Ann. I got goosebumps all over my body, but I brushed it off as a coincidence. At 7 a.m., some family members arrived early to help set up for the funeral. My shift was over, so I went to return the keys to the funeral director. I overheard the family members talking. That's when I learned that Mary had lung cancer. She had been a long-time smoker, and the family found her dead in a chair in the backyard, sitting in the cold while smoking. I never saw what the corpse looked like, whether or not it was the woman I saw the night before, and I didn't want to know. White sage. White sage is a powerful herb, traditionally used for cleansing and purifying spaces, objects, and even your energy. If you're looking for a natural way to clear negative energy or simply want to create a calm and peaceful environment, I highly recommend this white sage. It's perfect for smudging, meditation, or just refreshing your home. You can find a link to this high-quality white sage in the description box below. Thank you for supporting.